Every time there is a new phase in American neoconservative and Zionist militarism that is expressed in hostility toward Russia and toward increasing NATO's militaristic attitudes and positions vis-a-vis Russia, I'm amazed as this develops that the American public cannot see that their government has moved from merely being criminal and being run by a criminal cabal to being criminally insane. The fact is that when we look at this whole issue of Vladimir Putin's Russia and NATO, the United States has broken a series of explicit promises to Russia made by President Reagan and President Bush and codified in an agreement during the Clinton administration in the 1990s that, among other things, the United States would not move American and NATO military assets closer to Russian borders. We have broken that promise. We promised that we would not recruit former Eastern Bloc countries to join NATO. We have broken that promise. And then, of course, we have proceeded in what we've been doing against Russian interest in Ukraine, where we supported an illegal coup d'etat there in February of 2014. And, of course, what the United States has been doing in conjunction with Israel and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and the Gulf Cooperation Council states in supporting ISIS, yes, supporting ISIS, and supporting al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria in an attempt, among other things, to marginalize the Russian position in that part of the world. We have really been pushing the envelope. These policies are wrong, they're evil, and they're immoral, yes, but beyond that, they're simply insane. Why? Because Russia is a proud nation. Russia is a legitimate military power. Russia is a nuclear power. And as it stands right now, it is clear that in the world there has been a reversal from the America that I knew in the 1960s in regard to world opinion. At the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when I was a young boy, and my father was working for American Air Force Intelligence, and they were photographing those Russian missiles in Cuba, I think arguably that most of the peoples of the world, in truth, were supporting President Kennedy and the Americans over Khrushchev and Russia. And in the last analysis, I believe that the United States at that time won the battle in world opinion. That is no longer the case. The actions of the United States directed against Russia have not been favored by the rest of the world in whole and in part because the United States happens to be wrong. And what it's doing in Ukraine, what it's doing in Syria, what it's doing in Eastern Europe vis-a-vis Russia, all of this puts our government in the wrong at the same time that the world is increasingly not supporting American support of Israeli aggression in Palestine and in Gaza and this ongoing land thievery that is directed at the Palestinians both in East Jerusalem and also in the occupied territories. So when you look at the loss of American prestige in the world, part of that is economic, part of it's political. Increasingly, it's also military. These folks that are pushing the envelope that seem to want the United States in a direct military confrontation with Russia seem to have forgotten something. In my parents' generation, it took my parents' generation 3.5 years, 3.5 years roughly, from the time the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, to defeat both Imperial Japan and to assist in the defeat of Nazi Germany by being the key military force in the Western Front of the pincer movement against Hitler. When you look at what the United States has been doing in these last 14 years, we have been involved for three times the length of time that we were involved in the Second World War, floundering in Iraq, floundering in Afghanistan, creating new tragedies and new disarray in Libya and in Syria and in Yemen and in Somalia and in Pakistan with no end in sight. And as we get more people killed on both sides, as we borrow and spend additional trillions of dollars and continue performing pathetically, both politically and militarily, does any sane person really believe that the United States needs to add a political and military confrontation with Vladimir Putin's Russia to what it's been doing in the last 14 years? I don't know about you, but it strikes me as something that's not simply criminal, but it's criminally insane. the United States is going to be increasingly getting in over its head militarily. Its empire is overextended. Its national debt continues to burgeon. And it's perceived increasingly in the world not as a beacon of freedom, but now it is perceived as an aggressor, as a bully, as a supporter of evil around the globe, and as a supporter of a world system known as the New World Order, the global Zionist order that is based in what Netanyahu wants to do in creating greater Israel, but also supports a world banking system that is oppressing people and that is as much involved in stealing other people's resources, using the American military as a janissary force, both for Zionism and for multinational corporations. We no longer are perceived as the beacon of light in the world that perhaps we once were when I was a child. We're increasingly being seen for what we are. And do we need a confrontation with Mr. Putin? No, we don't. Not either in terms of political perceptions in the world or the fact that the Russians will be the most formidable political and national and military force that the United States has ever faced. If we choose to provoke Mr. Putin in Eastern Europe, if we continue trying to surround him in his southern underbelly, if we continue to threaten him and to attempt to humiliate him, the U.S. will be the loser. And so the American people need to insist that their government clean up its act, not simply in terms of its criminality, but at this point, the criminal insanity that it continues to endorse in Palestine, in Syria, and in Ukraine, and in a situation where we apparently not simply want to provoke Vladimir Putin into a military confrontation, but also to involve Iran and potentially even China. I don't know about you, but if the United States could not successfully prevail over the course of 12 to 14 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, does it really believe that it wants to be facing Russia, China, and potentially Iran in a new global endeavor? This is simply crazy.